Well, I was a child of the 1970s, so my political career started in the 1970s as a sort of budding young conservative, and I was inspired to get involved in politics by the emergence of Margaret Thatcher and the contrast in the 1970s between a failing state, the sick man of Europe, heavy, highly unionised industries, heavily subsidised, completely uneconomic and uncompetitive in a changing world market. And that clearly was not sustainable. And the alternative was the free market, free trade approach, all about inspiring entrepreneurialism, about rewarding people who took risks, who put forward capital to expand companies, to provide employment, for the good of the country as a whole. That contrast could not have been greater than in the 1970s. So that's where my political involvement started. And that was the beginning of the big battle of ideas between old-fashioned statism, corporatism, subsidising lame duck industries of the past, with looking forward to how we encourage innovation, entrepreneurialism, risk takers for the jobs and the economies and the businesses of the future. So that's the origins of my interest in free markets, and I think we have won that battle, but we could never be complacent. So free markets have certainly brought up the economies of Western democracies, and it's brought people out of poverty, and it's created middle classes who are the backbone of flourishing economies and free societies. But we mustn't stop at our own borders, because free markets have a really important role to play in emerging economies in the developing world as well. And nothing, I think, has shown that more starkly than some of the subsidies and the import controls and tariffs imposed by the EU on some of the poorest countries in the world. And it was the complete ridiculous situation, I think outrageous situation, that Western countries, EU countries and the UK were giving subsidies in international aid, quite rightly, to some of the poorest countries in the world to help them to alleviate poverty, and then putting import controls and tariffs on the very goods that we'd encourage them and help finance them being able to produce, particularly in the agricultural sector. That's a complete nonsense, which is why, being outside of the EU now, I hope that money that we are giving in international aid, and I'm a big supporter of well-used, properly focused international aid, that we can then trade freely with those countries with the fruits of their labours. And that is the key to success of making those successful, flourishing economies based on free trade, bringing up the whole population with them, and making them democratic nations enjoying the fruits of that free trade as well. And when you have international tariffs, when you had bars on free trade, when you have these artificial interventions by the state to subsidise goods that are not economic, not environmentally sustainable to produce in many cases, that distorts markets, and usually it mitigates against some of the poorest nations and some of the poorest people in society as well. So free trade, free markets, absolutely we can show how they've worked at home, but absolutely too we must champion their use in some of the poorest nations of the world. So one of my early experiences in politics was when I stood as the Conservative candidate in the 1992 election in Sheffield, Brightside, and sadly narrowly lost by 22,500 votes on election day. But Sheffield was a classic example of a city which had been made on steel and was the steel-making centre of the world at one stage. But increasingly over the decades, it had been overtaken by other nations producing steel more economically, although perhaps not more environmentally. But for many, many years, governments, local authorities were in denial about that, and public money was increasingly going into producing a product for which there were limited markets, and for which the fair market rate was not the rate at which it could be produced in Sheffield. So Sheffield was decimated. When I stood as the candidate, Sheffield was being reborn because it was private enterprise, it was enterprise zones, it was new forward-looking businesses of the future with new entrepreneurs, with tax breaks and incentives from government, but not big subsidies from government, that were recreating a new dynamic economy in the city of Sheffield. And Sheffield is now completely unrecognisable from the wastelands and the demise of the steel industry after the 70s and 80s. And that's the contrast. So free markets are about looking forward to markets, not trying to subsidise something that's had its day. So I think the Free Market Forum is a really good initiative and a really timely initiative. I think we've been intoxicated by the apparent allure of big government spending in order to address problems that have arisen during the emergency pandemic. That's understandable, but that's also not sustainable. And we've got to get back to traditional conservative values based on enterprise, free markets, free trade, rewarding those who take risks and those who innovate and those who produce businesses which produce jobs and which produce goods and services which people actually want to buy around the world at a rate they're prepared to pay, not ones that have been artificially propped up by the state to produce goods that are substandard and actually there's no real customer for. So we need to remind ourselves that that is the basis and the secret to a sound, sustainable economy which raises all parts of society. It's done so very successfully for decades in the West, and we need to make sure that we can replicate those values in the emerging world as well. And as we move beyond Brexit and the UK becomes increasingly global power and a global economy, we will succeed on that because of our success and our experience and our valuing of those free trade, free economy, enterprise principles. So I really welcome this initiative, and I really welcome this as a wake-up call to people to remind them what conservatism stands for and what generates wealth within free nations, and we need to get back to that.